Not yet. This is Emily Davis with Emily Davis Consulting. Thanks for joining the conversation today. I know that we have so far a small group of people on the call, but we may have more joining us. So we hope that's the case. In the meantime, just a couple webinar logistics for you is that we are going to make sure that everybody's muted so that we're reducing background noise, and we can do that on our end. And if we open up for conversation and you want to share your thoughts verbally, you can. You'll see on your screen that you can unmute yourself by just clicking that little arrow button and unmuting. We've also got a way to share questions and comments in that chat box on your screen. So feel free to type questions, comments, ideas as we go along. The more interactive this is, the better. And we're also going to pause for questions about halfway through and at the end. And then lastly, as Elizabeth mentioned, we are recording this, so folks can go back and listen to the recording and share with others. So with that, quickly it'd be great to hear about, it looks like we have one person on the call, and I'd love to hear, first of all, your role in the organization, and then a challenge or question you have about shared leadership. And I'm just going to bring up that first poll, which is, going back, is what's your role in the organization? Are you a board member? Are you a staff member? Are you a committee member? Maybe you have another role. And just clicking one of those boxes would be great, be really helpful to get participation and feedback on that. Okay, so board member and staff member. Okay, perfect. So the other thing I was hoping to hear is if you have a question or a concern related to sharing leadership between the board and the staff, if you want to type in a question or concern that you have here, that is going to be really helpful in the conversation for about the next hour, and I can hone in a bit more around a particular topic or issue that you have questions about. Now, the other thing I'll say is these webinars, this is our third in the series, and they're all somewhat building off of each other. So the initial webinar was really about board governance best practices, and we're building off of that, so we're not going to review all the board governance essentials to start with, but I am going to reference them from that first webinar a little bit just to set that foundation. So so far it doesn't look like there's any specific question or concern related to the shared leadership between board and staff. A lot of times in this conversation in particular, people just want to kind of be sponges and pick up whatever information that they can pick up. I wanted to real quickly take a second to introduce myself too, and in case you haven't heard me do this before, and share that my background and the way I come to this conversation is through a lot of different experiences as a board member, a staff member, a grant maker, a founder. I mean, I've worn a lot of different hats, which I think helps to give me a lot of different perspective and how to talk about these things. And so that's just a little bit about me. And as I mentioned, I want to take a look at what those essential board responsibilities are for every nonprofit board. Doesn't matter what kind of board you're talking about. The first job is really setting organizational direction. The second is provide, and that's things like strategic planning, long-term planning. It's not operational, it's not micromanagerial. And then the second is providing oversight, and that's things like asking questions and understanding what's happening with programs and finances, so on and so forth. And finally is ensuring necessary resources. And this is making sure that board members are, again, providing oversight and setting organizational direction as it relates to both human and financial resources. I mean, I think, we can't operate our organizations on fairy dust. We actually need money, and we need people who are experts to really fulfill their roles, whether it's staff or volunteers. And so in our conversation, we're going to talk more about what sharing leadership looks like in these roles and responsibilities. A lot of boards have folks who are not experts in the nonprofit sector. A lot of folks come from the for-profit or corporate sector. And I think it's very helpful when talking about any kind of leadership within boards of directors to highlight the differences between corporate and nonprofit boards. Now, this is going to be a follow-up handout that folks will get that has, or maybe have already gotten, which has a lot more detail in it. But some of the differences include things like the legal requirements. So for a nonprofit, you are legally required to have a governing board of directors. But in the corporate world, that's only true for publicly traded companies. So if you're a small business, you don't have to have a board. Additionally, things like compensation, and this is not true all the way through, but about 99% of nonprofit boards, 501c3, C4, C6 nonprofit boards, their board members are all volunteer. Part of this is because it's considered an unethical practice and somewhere around connected to conflict of interest to pay nonprofit board members. But that's not the case in the corporate world. Additionally, things like the executive director in nonprofit boards, they don't vote, where that is a hallmark, a cornerstone of corporate boards. So it's a funky setup. It doesn't make a ton of sense to a lot of people because here you have the executive director or CEO who's boots on the ground every day, but doesn't have the voting rights. So again, this isn't a perfect system, but the nice thing is we have tools for how to think about running nonprofit businesses with this setup as opposed to a corporate business. And then additionally, things like clients, right? So nonprofits have stakeholders versus shareholders. We have our human resources, our employees, there are donors, and our volunteers. Nonprofits are really fueled by volunteers, where for-profits have employees and clients. The other two things that I think are really important to note is the first is cash. And nonprofits, and this is where providing oversight and sharing leadership becomes really important, is nonprofits have can have a lot of restrictions on their cash. So it can be permanently restricted, temporarily restricted, or unrestricted. Well, for-profits don't have that model. They usually have unlimited use of the funds that they bring in. The other piece to funding is that it's with for-profits, you're typically selling a product or a service, whereas with nonprofits, the revenue sources are everything from individuals to corporations to foundations, fees for service, planned giving, social enterprise, which means that you really have to have expertise in all of those areas, even if at some level, even if it's to say that you're not going to pursue that funding source. So there's a lot to consider when you're thinking about a for-profit versus a nonprofit board. And how, this is going to affect, again, how you govern the executive director and the board as a collective, how they govern together because there's different kinds of setups. The other thing that's important to consider is that every organization is in a different stage of its organizational life cycle. So the practices of shared leadership are going to look very different for an organization in a startup phase versus an organization that maybe is in decline. And what I mean by that is in a startup phase, you may not even have an executive director. Your board and your committees may function as both the board members and as the staff. Now, in a decline phase or a turnaround phase, the shared leadership between the executive director and the board might look different. Perhaps the executive director needs to leave or is getting fired or whatever. There needs to be new blood that comes into the organization, in which case the board is going to be stepping up more than maybe staff in that case. So having an idea of where your organization is in its life cycle stage, and there's lots of models for this conversation, which is all what's on your screen in front of you, but knowing what life cycle stage your organization is in is going to be really helpful to better assess what shared leadership is going to look like for you and your organization between the executive director and the board of directors. And so with that, we have one quick poll question here, pretty easy, which is, do you have an executive director or chief executive director or chief executive officer? It's a simple yes or no. Great. So it looks like folks, so that's great. So having an this will help the conversation. Not that it's absolutely required, but it does help for context. When you are a board member, you're always a board member. Can't get away from that. Hopefully you don't want to. But there's different hats that we wear as board members. And again, this becomes particularly important for organizations that don't have an executive director, that don't have any director leadership. So the first hat is that legal hat. And there's really what we think of as three duties: duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. And this is care, things like paying attention and asking pertinent questions, coming to meetings prepared. The duty of loyalty is avoiding conflicts of interest, whether they're real or perceived. And then the last is the duty of obedience. And this one's pretty simple. It's really just following the letter and the spirit of the law, whether it's your own bylaws, it's state law, it's federal law, whatever it might be. And then the volunteer hat is one where we as board members are actually working for the staff rather than overseeing the staff ourselves, right? So a good example of this would be things like, you know, you're at a fundraising event or you're building a house and the staff is directing what board members as volunteers need to do. It's not a time to tell board members, or excuse me, time to tell staff members how to do things. Letting the staff members be the experts at that point is really important. And then lastly is this ambassador hat. And this is really connected to fundraising. Is you're opening up connections and resources and really bragging about the organization in the community. So when we're thinking about working side by side with the executive director or other staff, it's really important to ask yourself, which hat am I wearing right now and which hat should I be wearing? Because sometimes those aren't the same thing. Sometimes we need to shift and change hats. In the shared leadership conversation, we have different models of engagement, and I'm sure you're going to be able to see where you are and your organization is on this sort of spectrum. And the first model is talking about what's called governance as observation. You see this with a lot of founding organizations. So what I mean by that is that the executive director is the founder. And this is a lot of the rubber stamping, right? So there isn't a lot of discussion or challenging of conversation. It's the executive director recommends things, the board says yes, and you move on. There isn't a lot of debate. The other extreme is governance as micromanagement, where the executive director is actually completely displaced from the conversation, and the board is making all the decisions without listening to the input or really considering the executive director's feedback. And then finally, there's governance as attendance as another extreme, and that is really where no one's paying attention to anything, in which case you've probably got bigger problems and may not have your organization around for a whole lot longer. But really what we're trying to get to is this concept of governance as leadership, which there's publications written about this. There's a lot to be said about it. But governance as leadership is really where you have the executive director and the board as a collective actively engaged in governance work, in decision making and asking questions and planning and working side by side. It's one of those things where it's an art, I would say, even more than it is a science. But you would know when your organization is that observation, governance as observation quadrant, or the micromanagement quadrant, or the attendance quadrant. So sometimes it's also a process of elimination to know where you're at. But if you feel like there's good engagement from the board and the executive director, things are moving along well, you're probably closer to that governance as leadership model. I get from a lot of folks, how do we know if our board is engaged in the quote-unquote best ways or right ways? Well, I think there's a common misconception that board members have to know everything, right? That they have to have all the answers. And in fact, that's not true. A lot of times the best board members are the ones who know the best questions to ask. And again, this is based off of that concept of governance as leadership. And I always like to break it down into sort of 3 buckets of questions. It's the what, the how, and the why. And if you're in a board meeting as a board member, are you asking the right quote-unquote what questions? What's our capacity to do this? What does success look like? What is really the most important thing to us? And how questions being, how is this going to get done? How does it fit with our strategic plan? And why questions are often the ones that are left to the side. So why is this important? Not just important, but why is it important right now? Because a lot of times the timing has to be right for those good decisions. Should we consider other options? What are our stakeholders going to think? Things like that. So when you're in a board meeting conversation, the thing you want to listen for are what, how, and why questions being asked. And if you hear a lot of how questions being asked or how questions being answered, it's a good time to bring in that why question or that what question to really balance out looking at things from all angles in your board conversations, because that's really where you get to the quality conversations and decision making for the organization. The couple of the boards that I've founded and run, one of the things we would talk about is we tried very hard to stay away from the rubber stamping process. So if we had a decision that came before us that seemed like a slam dunk, we would try and come up with at least one reason why that might not work for us. Because it was our job to challenge and question and look at things from a variety of perspectives. And we asked our staff to present and behave the same way, sharing alternatives, what are the pros and cons, that kind of thing becomes, and you really feel like you're doing your job as a board member. It's very rewarding to say, we really looked at this X, Y, and Z decision from all angles. So talking about organizational structure a little bit I think it's not widely understood that the executive director and the board president are really, they're the main champions and liaisons. So the executive director is the liaison between the board and the staff. The board president or board chair is the liaison between the executive director and the board. And the relationship between the executive director and the board president or board chair becomes really important. If those two individuals aren't speaking to one another, aren't working proactively, they don't have to be best friends, but if they aren't working constructively together, then there start to be some hiccups and some miscommunications. And the board president really, again, can connect with that executive committee. Your executive committee is your board chair, your vice chair, your treasurer, your secretary. Sometimes people include a president-elect or a past president in that executive committee, but it's really officers. So the president plays an important role there, and also really models those basic roles and responsibilities around organizational direction, oversight, and ensuring resources. People look to him or her on the board to model those things. Now, the executive director is, again, the liaison to the staff, the volunteers. He or she is really in charge of making sure programs and operations are running. But where all of this comes together in the middle are committees. So committees are a great place for board and staff and volunteers of all kinds to work side by side. And that's really where there isn't, oh, as a board member, this is more your volunteer hat, right? Board member, you're not answering to me, but rather we're working together, again, side by side to complete a task or explore a possibility. So one of the things I wanted to do is just do a couple poll questions. We won't do all of them, but I wanted to, this is an activity that I do when I facilitate retreats around who leads certain efforts between the board, and when I say the staff, I mean the staff via the executive director. So who leads the effort? Is a board-led effort? Ultimately, are they responsible at the end of the day that it gets done and takes that first step forward? Is it led by the executive director with the staff? Again, at the end of the day, are they the ones who kick off the work and are accountable for it? Or is it split 50-50? Now, the thing is board and executive director or staff are always going to be involved in these next questions, but the question I'm asking is who really takes that first step? Who leads that effort? So we're going to do, these are very quick, but the first question, the first poll question is, makes a personal financial contribution to the organization. So that's cold hard cash. Is that a board-led activity? Does the executive director lead that activity, or does it happen equally? Is it an equal expectation of both the board and the executive director? So just take a guess. So this one is interesting because it's actually a board-led activity. The board is responsible for making a personally significant financial contribution to the organization. And having 100% board giving is really critical, not just time. A lot of folks will say, oh, but board members already give so much of their time, which is absolutely true, but so do volunteers who are not board members. Board members have a higher stake in the game, and they need to, again, model what they are asking others to do. So if I'm a donor and your biggest champions aren't giving, why should I? So here's another one. And these are always really tough questions. This is why we ask them, as they bring up great conversation. So monitors income and expenses on a daily basis. Is that a board effort, an executive director effort, or is it split 50-50? And I think daily basis is the key to this one. Yes, absolutely. That is the executive director, even if he or she is delegating to a director of finance, but looking at the financials on a daily basis is really important, whereas you have board members who are going to see monthly or quarterly financial reports, their responsibility is knowing what questions to ask and understanding how to read those financial reports and the story that they tell. So let's do this one. Prepares for board meetings. Is that shared between the board and the executive director? Is it led primarily by the executive director or primarily by the board? Awesome. Yeah, it's 50-50. It'd be very hard to prepare for a board meeting without the executive director's input, and it certainly would be very hard to prepare for a board meeting without the board involved. So absolutely, those are really important things. And here is just it's kind of a quick view of shared leadership that I like to go through with folks. So here we have on the left-hand side is really where the board takes that first initial step. Things like creating and reviewing organizational policy. And a lot of that comes out of day-to-day activities. So on the other side of the spectrum, you see the executive director raises policy questions. So if there is you need a gift acceptance policy, that's something that the board approves. The board also provides oversight and hires the executive director as well as supports and evaluates. That's something that they need to lead. That one seems pretty obvious. Where the executive director is responsible for hiring and providing oversight to the staff. And so it's really important that board members not go around the executive director and take over that role. If there are other problems happening, for example, staff doesn't like the executive director, things aren't going well, that's where the annual performance evaluation process is really important. And unless something serious and illegal is happening, the staff really needs to talk to the executive director about any concerns with the board, not going straight to the board, and vice versa. So the other thing is connections to funding. Board members open up connections to funding sources, whether it's individuals or grants, whatever it might be. You're an ambassador in the community, opening up those opportunities. And the executive director is really the chief fundraiser. So I often say to people, if you have an executive director who doesn't want to fundraise or refuses to, you have the wrong executive director, because that person is the face of the organization. They are the person that donors want to connect with and hear from. Additionally, the executive director reports on operations. So how are we doing in our fundraising strategies? What's happening with our programs? So the executive director is really responsible for overseeing and implementing programs. Now that might not be the ED him or herself every time, especially if you have other staff to do those things. That might be a role that he or she delegates, but ultimately the executive director is responsible for making sure this happens. And then back on the board leadership side, the board really needs to be invested in its financial due diligence. And like I said, being able to read those financial reports and knowing what questions to ask. In addition to the financial resources, the board needs to be in charge of its own recruitment and retention of board members. Now, that's not to say, again, as I said earlier, that the executive director isn't involved. It's just that the board should be responsible for itself. The extreme example in this is that if the executive director is filling the board with his or her friends, it sort of becomes a social club or runs the risk of higher liability because you don't have folks or liability in that governance is observation, right? If there isn't a lot of challenging or diversity of perspectives at the table, you can open yourself up to liability and conflicts of interest, all kinds of things. So really having board members recruit other board members and having a process for that becomes really important. And then right smack dab in the middle is where we're split 50-50 on shared leadership between the board and the executive director. So the first thing is the strategic plan. And again, this is something that's different than for-profits. In a corporate situation, the board hires the CEO to write and implement the plan. In nonprofits, you need the board and the executive director working together equally to help create that plan. Now, this is something that I do, and because I do it, I also know how important it is. If you have the board not involved in looking at the organizational priorities, goals, and objectives, they're not going to be good ambassadors on behalf of that. They won't be able to inform it or implement it. The same thing with the executive director. I think what's a little bit different in nonprofits as well is there's two places that I always say an organization needs to hire external consultants. It's capital campaigns and strategic planning. It's very hard to do well internally. The other things that they share leadership on are fundraising strategies. Again, agreeing on where the organization will and will not raise money from. Preparing for board meetings, as mentioned in that poll question. And then evaluation. So evaluation are things like if you're going to do a board self-evaluation, then you need the executive director to participate as he or she is part of the board, even though non-voting. Similarly, with a performance evaluation of the executive director, you want the board providing feedback on their experience. All right, so I think it would be a good spot to, Elizabeth, just to pause for a second. I don't see any questions coming in, but Donna, I'm going to unmute you too and just see if there are any questions up to this point so far. So everybody's unmuted.
Donna, do you have any questions? Okay, so one question that I would ask, and especially since we're right at the spot with shared leadership,
yeah,
this great graph. So what advice would you give if there is a board member that is overstepping and is trying to manage staff?
Oh, yeah. That's a great question, and it happens all the time, right?
Yeah.
So I would say this is a great place for, it depends, where this observation is coming from, but ultimately it's a great idea to have the board president. Hopefully it's not the board president this is a problem with, but so first scenario is that the board president sits down and says, listen, really just has a conversation and says, I know you really want to be involved. This is a great place to review the different hats people wear to say, I need you wearing your volunteer hat more in certain scenarios. We've hired a great executive director. Let's let our executive director do their job. If you have concerns or anything, why don't you come to me as the board president? And we talk through it together. I think if you have a problem at the board president level, it gets really complicated, except that if you can find another executive officer who can be a champion or ally to have that conversation one-on-one, that becomes really important. Finally, if you are another board member and you see this happening in a scenario, it's kind of board governance bystander intervention, is to step in and say, listen, I don't think this is our role here. Let's provide the feedback to the executive director. Because he or she knows more of what's going on than we do. And listen, I've been involved in those scenarios, and it's tricky. It's not easy. So I think this is the art of really good leadership, is talking to people one-on-one. You certainly don't want to shame or embarrass anybody. So is that helpful, Elizabeth?
Yeah, that answered it quite well. Thank you.
Sure, of course. So if there are other questions that come up, feel free to throw them in that chat box. Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving forward with a few things here. And I think, Elizabeth, I think this next slide really speaks to that question as well. We have this concept that we talk about in strategic planning of operations and altitude, and it very much connects to the different hats we wear. I think this concept and the hat concept overlap really well in that when you are wearing your legal hat, when you're, making those strategic decisions for the organization, when you're at that 15 to 30,000 foot level, that's where the executive director and the board members are working together on everything like strategic planning, mission, vision, values, just general oversight of the organization. And then as you get more into the treetops, that's a really good place for the executive director and committees and other staff members to be working together on things like work plans and operationalizing that strategic plan. How do we, what are the ins and outs of getting this done? And then finally, when you're, what we all refer to as kind of in the weeds, you're digging in the dirt, is really where you've got your staff and your volunteers. And the digging in the weeds for Habitat is, building houses, getting the work done, planting things and building things. And for board members, a lot of times we need to hold each other accountable by saying, like in a board meeting, if we're talking about what color the stain is going to be on the new house that's being built, it's time to pull up an altitude in your board meeting. That's not a great time to have that conversation. So I like to really use this conversation around operations and altitude and say, are we too far in the weeds? Do we need to pull up an altitude for the conversation we're having? Things like that. So this is a model that could be used as well when you have a board member micromanaging, is to say, I think you're in the weeds on this, let's pull up an altitude. Along with all of that becomes this really important role of supporting your executive director. And you want to go beyond the sort of checklist items, right, of, okay, we've done an assessment. And I sort of kid about this one a little bit in that I was facilitating a retreat years ago with an executive director and a board. There's part of their strategic planning, and was talking about the importance of performance evaluation. The executive director had never had an evaluation and really wanted one. He'd been there 7 years. So I went and talked a lot about the importance of that, yada, yada. And one of the board members in the front said, well, I totally disagree with you. We don't need to do performance evaluation because if I've got a problem with him, I'm just going to tell him. But that's not evaluation. That's an opinion. That's feedback. Evaluation and performance review is really about going beyond the basics of just having a conversation and saying, I liked or didn't like what you did, but really creating a plan for success. So that's an example of going beyond the basics. I think also knowing where your organization is in its life cycle stage will help to set pretty clear expectations for your executive director. So if you're at a startup phase, you are always going to have more on your plate than you can get to. And being realistic with your executive director, helping that person to prioritize what's going to be most important for the organization is really, really helpful. Defining your culture. Is your culture of your board and governance one more of corporate structure? Do you follow Robert's Rules of Order to a T, or is it a little bit more democratic? Do you do things socially outside? So describe, if someone came to you and said, what's your board culture like? Or your organizational culture, what does it feel like? You want to think about how you operate meetings or how you communicate. But being able to define that is going to be really helpful for your executive director, or even finding the right executive director. Orientation seems to be something that we all like to skip over. And how that often happens is handing somebody a manual of documents electronically or in print and saying, read this, which is not really an effective tool for good orientation. You want it to be in person. You have to understand that you're gonna need to go over things repeatedly. I've always said that for any new job, particularly as an executive director, it takes a good 6 months to a year to get really oriented. It takes quite a bit of time. And that means being patient, right? As board members, being patient with your executive director, knowing that he or she can't get to everything at one time, right? Or there might be a crisis that comes up that you don't know about in the office, right? So being patient, asking questions, and then being open to new ideas. Perhaps you have an executive director who's got some new ideas for how to run meetings or to change a program. You know, I think nonprofits forget we're inherently entrepreneurial. We take risks. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that that's part of what we do and be willing to step into that. Now, the last thing is on this topic is I would say around having expectations and being really clear about your expectations with your executive director, right? So understanding what time management looks like and helping to prioritize. And the strategic plan can certainly help with this. But being really clear with the board and the executive director, what are the priorities we're focusing on this month, next 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever it might be, being clear about the time commitment, the priorities you all need to focus on. Certainly having an updated job description becomes really important. I would recommend updating it every year and making sure it's accurate and doing that with the executive director. A lot of times the board development or governance committee will do this. And then, thinking about in meeting with your executive director, when is it appropriate to have either difficult conversations or just strategic conversations? Is it going to be more effective to do so one-on-one in group meetings? Find out how you maybe want to cover your expectations for your board or for your executive director. I think the how we do things is just as important as what we do. So what's going to be the best way to deliver those expectations and for whom to deliver those expectations to the executive director? Is it as a group? Is it one-on-one? But no matter what, you want to communicate very clear expectations and to the executive director. And on the flip side, you want to make sure that your board is informed about the process, the work that you all are doing as it relates to that. Now, there's always a possibility for warning signs if you have a difficult relationship with your executive director, and here are a few of them. Is if you have an executive director who's ordering people around rather than listening and discussing, maybe there's very limited interaction with the executive director. You don't see or hear from the ED very often, and there's no real feedback loop. There's not that ongoing communication. Rather, it's just the executive director making decisions without the input of the board that are really important, those decisions which are really important for the board to be informed on, right? So things like major financial decisions, strategic direction of the organization, and that what's happening is the executive director is, again, displacing that board to a place of governance as observation. Anytime you're worried that your executive director might be hiding information is a really good point to have some interception and conversation about those concerns. You want to not wait too long. I think oftentimes we are a little bit too polite and worry somebody will get offended, but ultimately this is about serving the organization, and that's what needs to be at the forefront. So those are some of those pretty common warning signs we see. the relationship between the executive director and your board chair, your board president, is really important, right? So we actually do a board chair peer group every year in Colorado, in Denver or Boulder, because that board chair role is so important. And I've said this before, but the executive director and the board chair, they're both liaisons, right? They're liaisons between the board and the staff. And it's incredibly important that those folks have that regular contact, that they're sharing in the facilitation of everything from meetings to difficult conversations to determining who they will ask to delegate to what, that they really need to be on the same page in terms of both planning and preparing for everything from board meetings to those funder conversations. I often recommend that the board chair and the executive director chat by phone once a week or once every other week. Even if it's a brief 10-minute check-in, to have that investment and that connection becomes super helpful in the long run, more than I think people realize. A lot of times it's not, what if everything's going great, but what if something's not going great and you haven't checked in one way or another to find out? And then you can sometimes get into those warning signs or that imbalance in governance. So I've mentioned several times the importance of assessment for your chief executive. I recommend the best case scenario, first of all, is that this is done annually. It's conducted by your board governance or your executive committee. And it really becomes a measurement tool for this board to have some metrics to evaluate the executive director over time. Sometimes it just means it's a bit of insurance. So if there's a problem and the executive director isn't fulfilling those roles, you've got some documentation. The best performance assessments have a variety of stakeholders providing input, from board to staff to donors to volunteers to community partners. Now, not everybody can do that, and that's understandable because it's a lot of work, but you want to make sure that you have a regular, consistent process for evaluating your executive director. You also want to do the same thing for your board members. And an annual board self-assessment is a great tool. And there's samples of this all over the place, but the only difference with this is you don't really include as many stakeholders. It's the board and the executive director, only because community stakeholders probably don't know as much about what's happening on the inside of your board of directors. So, but it is important to have the board evaluating itself to say what are our strengths and our challenges, where do we want to go, and give yourself some good feedback. And if it's, there's a lot of surprising things that can come out of board self-assessments that are really worth checking into. I always learn something when I participate in or conduct a self-assessment that people didn't realize. And I actually recommend that board members do this before they do board recruitment, because it's really helpful in identifying strengths and challenges within the board and help to target new board members. So in part of that healthy board governance, you want to not only do that board self-assessment, but you want to have really clear expectations for the board by having board job descriptions, everything from your members at large to those executive officer positions, and to orient the board members when they join the board. But I actually think it's a great idea to do an annual orientation in person, just because who can remember all the important details that you heard, once 3 years ago? It's great to have a refresher opportunity, and you can evaluate everything from your board, through your board self-assessment. You can evaluate the culture, the way meetings are run, both your short-term and your long-term goals. But it's also a place to celebrate. You know, when you set good expectations, when you set people up for success, and board members individually or as a collective have those wins, big or small, you want to celebrate them. And that's and the same thing with your executive director. If you have an executive director who's knocking things out of the park, you really want to acknowledge and celebrate that. It will make that experience of sharing leadership between board and staff that much better. I wanted to share just 2 more things before we break for questions and start to wrap up. And this is a little bit of a shift because I know that people ask a lot about fundraising and how do you share leadership between the board and the executive director related to fundraising. We talked about the executive director being the chief fundraiser. And so a quick note on this is the executive director plays this part in fundraising that we've already talked about, including that he or she is the media spokesperson. So board members really shouldn't be reaching out to the media unless there's a specifically approved strategy connected to that. But the development staff, if you have fundraising staff of any kind, they really get into the nuts and the bolts and the operations of fundraising. And there's a concept called moves management, which is basically strategies for increasing donations, particularly from individuals. And what are those strategies that will engage people further in the organization and increase their giving? Where the board plays a role we've talked about this, but it's important to highlight again, is connecting to funding opportunities. How they do that is a big conversation. Making those personally significant financial contributions, and ensuring that there are policies in place related to fundraising, gift acceptance policies, ethics policies. There's all different kinds of fundraising policies out there. And then where, again, in fundraising specifically, where board and staff work side by side are on those committees, a development committee or a fundraising committee, but they can get into the weeds and the details of creating plans and campaigns and strategies. That is the place to do that, not in a board meeting setting. Now, I know that Donna has staff person or an executive director, as does obviously Elizabeth, but one thing just for recording purposes I do want to point out is that if you don't have staff, it's going to be okay. One of the best things that you can do as a board is to use your committees like you would a staff person. So if you have a fundraising committee, that you treat that as the work of a development director until you can bring on that staff. It's really important when you don't have staff and you're all volunteer run with your board that you know what hat you're wearing when. Are there times where you need to pull up an altitude? Is it the right setting to have a particular conversation? I think the more people can invest in hiring executive director expertise, the better. I mean, these folks this isn't a hobby. They should be good at what they do. And so raising that money for that staffing and creating those job descriptions and policies and things that are really going to set the whole organization up for success is really important. And you can do all of this without actually having an executive director on board yet. It's just framing it in a way that's going to work and getting creative with it. So that brings me to question and answer. If there are questions or comments, I'm going to unmute folks. I would love to hear anything that's out there. It threw a lot out there, and yet some of it is probably feels like it makes a lot of sense, hopefully. So any questions, comments, dedications?
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and ask one. In terms of board giving, who would you say has the role of holding the board accountable?
Great. That is an awesome question. It's not the executive director, I can tell you that much. And I'm just going to bring up some resources on this next slide, Elizabeth, as I talk about that. It's either the board president, or a lot of times it's the treasurer or whoever is the chair of the fundraising committee. Those are three possibilities. And how one holds the board accountable to this isn't going around at every board meeting and saying, Joe, you didn't give yet, and Karen, you haven't given yet. It's really having a report that says, or reporting out and saying, to date, we have 70% of the board members have made a financial contribution. Please be sure, if you haven't done so, to make your gift by whatever the date is, June 30th or whatever your goal is. And every board and organization does it differently. Some have a set gift amount. Some don't have a set gift amount that people can give as much as they want and fundraise as much as they want, bring in that money. People do it all different ways, but ultimately boards should be responsible for each other. It's very awkward for the executive director to have to do that. So I don't know that there are any other questions, which is totally fine, but here are some resources that I think are really helpful in this conversation. The Nonprofit Board Answer Book is one of my favorite books. It's a great reference tool. I highly recommend it. And then a lot of these other items are, publications are from BoardSource, who they're just fantastic. They have great resources. And finally, this is my contact information. So you know where to find me. If you have a question, perhaps I can help. But again, this is an interesting conversation because it's a little bit science, but it's mostly art. And a lot of times it's kind of, you know it when you see it, either when things are going right or wrong. So I think I will leave it at that. Elizabeth, is there anything else that we need to cover before we sign off right on the hour here?
No, I think we're good. Just again, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to working with you in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it, and hopefully see some folks soon.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks.